And now for something completely different.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi. Welcome to the future.
But no. Remember, no guts, no galaxy.
Welcome to the No Guts, No Galaxy podcast number 165. We are your host, Darren and Phil, and today is Thursday, August 2nd, 2018. And I just want to say hello. Darren, how are you doing?
Good. I am looking forward to today's podcast, which we are going to jump right into. It is definitely good to be back and doing another podcast. Today, our guests are Paul Inouye, lead designer for MechWarrior Online, and Chris Lowrey, designer for MechWarrior Online. How are you guys doing today? Chris, you first.
I'm doing pretty good. How about yourself?
Good. It is early afternoon, beautiful day in the Pacific Northwest, and we are here to talk mechs, specifically balance. Now, Paul, you want to say hi?
Hello.
And that's the last you're going to hear from Paul.
Yeah, that's it.
It's actually cloudy here in Vancouver, so the temperature has dropped about 10 degrees, so we can actually sleep at night now.
We just had a heat wave. Now the thing
Mike, don't you stop.
Now,
Stop.
listen.
No,
the thing about
you-
a heat wave in the Northwest is that nobody up here has air conditioners, right, Paul? That's why it was tough for you to sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh,
We're
I
used
can
to
just
cold
hear
weather.
it now. Woe is me. It's 70 degrees. It's so hot. Oh, I'm dying.
It got into the upper 90s, or
Oh
I
my
mean
God.
upper 80s, right, Paul?
You guys, look at you, Darren.
hit
Look how much
33
you've
degrees.
changed. Not
I love
long
it.
ago,
I
he
love
used to
it
be
up here.
crying about the, no.
California is burning up right now, and I
Well,
have nothing
yeah.
to do with it.
That's why I told you to leave.
This is why we rely on heat for balance. Okay, let's move on.
Jumping right into it, Paul.
Yeah, so obviously we got a lot to talk about. We've got balance, we've got PTS and stuff like that. And I'm looking forward to it. We've been doing a lot of talking on streams. Literally, by the way, Chris, I shared a little tidbit about how much we drive Darren nuts, how much we talk behind the scenes. Like, people don't realize,
true.
like, me and Chris will be on TeamSpeak talking. Darren will come in and be like, "Are you guys really?"
When
like,
I'm having
serious?
trouble sleeping, sometimes I'll just turn that on. And
Yeah.
no, these guys, look, it's true. Balance discussions often are hard for me to sit through because it is a lot of work, and it's work that certain types of people enjoy over other types. I like jumping in and playing the game. I like hanging out with people. But you guys specifically here are very much into the numbers and the balance, and that's awesome. We need that in every game and sometimes in life. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. We are talking about balance, and we're talking about PTS, as Phil just mentioned. Now, it's important, I think, to let everybody know right now that this is more about relaying information, what's been happening with PTS, what's been happening with balance, and the discussion is going to happen where, Chris and Paul?
Forums.
There you
Basically, after we finish this podcast, like I said, we're going to open up a forum post and we can start the discussion. Now, right now, there is one that started before the Faction Play podcast, which will be coming up. That discussion is already ongoing with on the forums, and I am there, active, talking with people who are posting, taking in all the feedback, taking in all the suggestions, and it's going to be a much more, I guess, casual approach to communications rather than the kind of sterile, vetted official comms.
So
Yep.
on that note, though, as far as the faction play, should people wait to post? That way they can hear you, what you're wanting from them, ideas. Maybe there's some constraints, or like, hey, we can do this, but maybe this not so much. Did you tell them just to hold off on that?
The thing is that when it comes to balance, there's no real constraints, right? Like,
Yep.
yeah, we can't rewrite the whole weapon system, but at the same time, we can take a look at numbers, we can take a look at suggestions and all this stuff. Whereas with faction play, it's a feature set change, right? And that has some pretty big restrictions on it. So it's a matter of, like, you might want to wait for the podcast to do your feedback, or if you just have something you just want to have heard, right? Go ahead, feedback right now.
Yeah, now that's an important note there, is that because obviously you go to Reddit, you go to even on the forums or whatever, you'll have people saying that PGI doesn't read. I have access to the internal discussions, and I know that that is absolutely not the case. I understand why people feel that way. Sometimes it's like, well, they didn't listen to what I said, or they didn't listen to what me and my group of friends said, or they didn't act on what we said, and therefore they're not listening. You know, listening is sometimes agreeing and sometimes not agreeing. But the important thing is to get there, get your voice out. For sure, if you don't post, you're not a part of the discussion, you won't be a part of the discussion. So it would be great for everybody to take part in the faction play discussion that is up there now. But I do agree that waiting for the podcast, which should happen within a week or so, would be a better start on that. Yep. But tonight we're here about balance and we're here about PTS. So in terms of balance and what PGI is looking for, what does balance mean to PGI? Paul, do you want to get us kicked off with what that means?
Well, I'd like to just start with recapping what I said in my original post, right? Is that we are doing focused balance passes here. We're not doing a global balance pass. This is why right now we are focusing on that 94 point alpha. We're focusing on the energy, I guess, voting, or let's call it what it is, what everybody else says, energy vomit. We're focusing on that, right? It's not saying this is the only stuff we're ever going to change, and right now we're just going to smash the crap out of the clans. That's not the case, right? We do know that when these kinds of changes go into a game, you're going to have to make an accountability on the other side as well. In this case, if we do some of the numbers from what's currently on PTS, we would probably have to address the whole thing about the armor quirks on Inner Sphere side, right? Because there are some of those Inner Sphere mechs out there that are quite tanky. Now, people know that my favorite mech is the K2. Personally, I feel like the K2 is a little bit too tanky for what it's doing. I've been stuck in situations where I'm just getting hammered left, right, and center, and I'm just like alive. I'm going, why? Right? And it's because of these quirks. So it's a matter of addressing that. Further down the road, we just want to make sure that when we announce something going on PTS, that it is for test purposes and it's for data collection purposes. Just because it's on a PTS does not mean that the next patch those numbers are going live, and that's evident by what happened with PTS 1 and 1.1 here recently with the laser changes. And I'll let Chris go in on details of it, but it just didn't meet the numbers that we were wanting. Right, it did go in the right direction, yes, but then was it affecting the game the way we wanted it to? Was it affecting the game negatively in terms of what the player feedback was on the PTSs? No, it wasn't meeting those criteria. So we're pulling those back out. We're looking at them. Yes, there might be some numbers changed in the same direction as the PTS, but not at the current values, that's for sure. Other than that, like I said, I'll let Chris go into the details of what happened with PTS 1 and 1.1.
Well, first, do you guys mind if we talk about, again, let's reiterate what PTS is. So can we talk about the PTS process? Chris, would you be comfortable doing that? What is PTS? What's the purpose? What does PTS even stand for? Maybe some people out there that don't know. Chris?
Well, PTS stands for the Public Test Server, and very heavy emphasis on the test part of that. The numbers that we basically put up on PTS are never really considered final release date values. We're explicitly putting them up there to pretty much test various things and both monitor data as well as form feedback to see if we're effectively getting the results that we want. As far as like the values go, I know that there's always a lot of talk about PTS values when we put them up there. Due to how we kind of conduct PTSs, and how we usually have very limited time to pretty much conduct tests, what we tend to do is we tend to put values that are pretty much on kind of the high spectrum of changes that we're doing. So probably a little bit too, even by our own internal estimations, probably too much, as far as where we drive things. But we do that for very deliberate reasons. As Paul, has basically said, it's mostly for test purposes, and we're trying to do that to both kind of push how far we can get out of the data, as well as, identifying where pushing in certain directions causes breakpoints in both what user behavior can be, what in-game behavior can be. So, and all this effectively filters into what we view internally and kind of the decision-making process that happens there. So nothing that we really put up there is really being considered primarily for release in the state that it is in. It is literally there to give us some data sets as well as some player feedback to kind of take to the table when we have these internal discussions and see what the best way forward is.
All right. Now, I know, Chris, you and Phil did participate a lot in the PTS implementations. I don't know if it was both 1.0 and 1.1 that you guys were streaming or whatever, but can you guys fill me in on your experience? Not necessarily the data. We can get into what specifically came of 1.0 and 1.1 next, but I'd love to hear from you and Phil what your experience was participating in PTS.
On my side, participating is going to be a little bit different from what other people see, because for the most part, I'm participating there. Like, I test values internally from a lot of the I would say heavy traffic variants, like the Death Strikes, the Hellbringers, and various other things. And so when PTS comes around, I'm mostly trying to test things on the other side of the equation, which is pretty much how inner sphere mechs interact with these adjusted clan values through the use of skilled players and as opponents. And for the most part, my experience is always I try to kind of divorce myself from what I'm feeling and let the players kind of have their say as far as what they're experiencing. But also because I'm going to have to go through the data and pretty much come to conclusions on my own. But yeah, Phil, you would probably be a better,
Are you saying I was a better lab rat? That's what I'm getting. So my experience was that you saw a sort of a switch, and that switch was instead of taking X weapons, I would take X plus Y. And what that X plus Y was, where we saw where you could take more large pulse or more ER larges, which was okay, instead of the ER mediums, I'll just take, for instance, on the Death Strike or the Marauder 2C, I'll just take more heavy-handed long-range weapons. So it was sort of like, hey, yes, it hits those weapons, but just like everything we do as players, when we're min-maxing, we just sort of bypass it and say, okay, yes, it did affect that, but this is what we're going to do now. And the side effect, I think, was long-range play became a little bit more effective as well. So the PTS1 results. Also, the Gauss recoil, did it have a change? I would say yes. Did it have an overarching, I think it met the goal? I don't think so, because basically what it means is you have to fire your lasers and at the end of the burn, release your Gauss as well. And for a skilled player, they can do that, not a problem. Does it break up? Yeah, barely. And against slow-moving targets, whatever, it's not going to make any difference. So that was my overall experience on PTS1, which was it didn't quite achieve the goal, reducing some damage on some lasers. I do think there's validity in looking at that. I don't know if the heat scale changes align with that. Like if it would have been ER large is still set to 2 and large pulse is still set to 2, then it would have had an impact a little bit more. But I think something to bring up just sort of as a point is the difference between clan lasers and their profiles. Like, is there a DPS? Is there a FaceTime? Is there burst DPS options? And of course, from a min-max player, what is the best option right now? I can just step around a corner and just alpha. But on PTS 1.1, this was the duration increase. So this actually had a reverse effect when I got done, and Chris, you were there, which was a slight duration increase on X amount of lasers. And did you notice a difference? Yes, on some. It was negligible, I would say. I think it could have been even more heavy-handed. But that being said, if you increase duration, there's a knockdown effect, which is you're now more sustainable because that 0.2 seconds the heavy large takes, which from 1.55 is 1.75. Ooh, that's a huge number. No, it was barely noticeable. you also got 0.2 seconds more of sustainability. And so from a player play style, being able to stand poke out alpha and stand back and cool off, it was actually it was a betterment to that sort of play style. And that's sort of what I came to the conclusion of both, which was there was some good stuff there, but not quite hitting the mark.
Well, ultimately, there are people with differing opinions on the forum and whatnot. So, and this is kind of why I don't like necessarily providing my own personal opinion on things, because Paul and myself have to kind of be the arbiters of what everyone else says, and so we have to effectively stay impartial to these kind of things, and so we lean predominantly on people like Phil and people in the community that post on the forums to kind of provide their own experiences on things, so we could take a fresh look at stuff. But Phil did touch on a number of things that I can't talk about. The first is kind of this notion that the good players will work around everything and just find a different loadout that gets similar results. We're not against certain loadouts effectively being effective. We obviously want people to be able to customize their mechs and to go into a match and to do well in them. But where I kind of come in on any kind of balanced discussion is to basically judge what kind of loadouts are effective and what can effectively counter them or can be effective counterplayed around them. So Phil, I know that you were talking to me about kind of the Death Strike and how people just would ton down the engine, put in an extra large class laser and drop a single medium, and so like you said, it gets more into those long range fights. We don't necessarily take any opinion on that. We're fine with things being effective, but the big question for me is pretty much how much is that build getting out of that effectiveness. So in the case of the Death Strike, where you basically get an extra large laser, in order to do that, you need a ton down. It's less heat efficient. It has less alpha than where everything was before. And yes, it's still effective at long range, but you're also making yourself more vulnerable to closer range engagements. So we're not necessarily against good players finding good builds that can replicate the effects. On my end, it's more about what can someone do to effectively counter those builds, and what kind of options are available to basically have those builds become vulnerable compared to where they were before. And as I said with the Death Strike, you're shaving off less speed, less heat efficiency in order to get that more potency at range.
And I think what's tough with the PTS is because we only have 4-on-4. I don't think sometimes you get the full aspect of like what a match would be, because ultimately, yes, the builds you're talking about generally took a hit. I would say the Death Strike, Marauder 2C, not as much. Hunchback 2C, meh, sort of. And there was a few other mechs as well with those loadouts, but it's just how does it actually, that 10% or 5% loss in heat efficiency, that whatever top speed, does that matter with a counter of a, let's just say a brawler, someone pushing or something like that? And when on PTS, unfortunate thing is like everybody's in assaults. I dropped in a light a few times and it was just like, yep, just a bunch of nope. And so, yeah, the other thing too is like, how much did it change the bar of alpha, right? Because you have alpha, which is just how much can you just hit the target, right, in one volley. But then you have sustainability, and I feel like there's multiple layers to the discussion of balance, which is, yes, I know 94 alpha, a lot of people are like, oh, that's extreme, but it's possible, and there's some higher ones out there too. But I would say too is we've seen a sustainability go from, back in the day, it used to be 30, right? 30, 35 alpha back in the day with, cataphracts, dragon slayers. And we've gone from 30 sustainability now to 60 through 75 sustainability. And that means being able to just do damage, And lasers, for the most part, are I wouldn't say a low skill weapon, so don't take that in the wrong way, but comparatively to like being able to place a Gauss round or a PPC or land an SRM volley or an AC-20, to be able to just point, click, and whomp, there goes, 70 points of damage. You duck behind cover, and then in a few moments you can do that again. So that the alpha didn't really change too much. And I feel like, so that's what I was saying, is I feel like it hit some marks on PTS 1, but not as much. And then same thing with like PTS 1.1 is the damage itself that's still out there, and the sustainability really hasn't taken a hit. And if anything, on PTS 1.1, it improved with those said weapons.
Well, sustainability, I think, is the big thing that, is one of the parts of the equation that we do look at. Because I know that a lot of, when we put the 94 damage number out there, people were, pointing to a lot more heavier alphas and stuff. And that's fine, but what we were mostly touching on with what our issues with the 94 alpha wasn't so much that it was doing 94 damage. There's many alphas out there and many other loadouts that can do even more than that. But what we were getting at was that it's the 94 damage in addition to everything else that comes along with that for those particular builds. Mainly that they're not necessarily sacrificing much speed. They have the sustainability that you basically have indicated, and they're still able to get that alpha while maintaining things like jump jets and cool shots and various other things. So it's not necessarily the 94 damage that is the main culprit that we're trying to bring into line, so much that it is that high of an alpha in comparison to everything else that is out there, especially on the inner sphere side, in addition to how fast the mechs can go, what kind of attributes it carries with it, in addition to having all those different components. The Direwolf can get up to about 110, 120 alphas, but it's sacrificing a lot of speed and a lot of durability in comparison to other mechs in order to acquire that.
So I have a question, Paul or Chris. You have the community out there that is listening, and they're saying, well, why don't you just buff all the weapons? I know you sort of addressed that in your post, but can we talk about that just for a moment? Because every single conversation that we have, streaming every single day, and I think it's a valid question, but why not just buff? Why not bring back Gauss Peep? Why not just buff LBs? Why not just buff ACs? Why not just shrink spread on SRMs? Bring them back. Why not just do that? And why are we so focused just on the lasers?
Now, there's a lot of things to kind of get into with that. First off, one of the big balance points that we have to kind of keep an eye on with MWO is pretty much the spread between 20 to 100 ton mechs and the capabilities that they bring to the table. So one thing that universal weapon increases do is they tend to get weighted more towards the heavier end, the more weapons you include into that global increase. Things like Gauss rifles and AC-20s, buffs to those weapons effectively aren't buffs to anything below 50 tons. And so what ends up happening is that those weapons that can't be utilized by the lower end of the spectrum get buffed, and things on the assault and heavy front can definitely either level out or improve, but those improvements are only felt on one side of the overall spectrum of mechs available in the roster. So that's something that we always have to keep an eye on and keep a careful ope on. But as far as like the laser changes and what we're looking for in things like we were testing in PTS 1, as we've basically communicated in a lot of the posts that we put up regarding PTS, it's not so much that we're targeting lasers because lasers are, the big bad that everyone is utilizing, so much that we are finding kind of an imbalance in the effectiveness of overall lasers on the clan side compared to the IS side, and how that affects builds that can pretty much bring comparable loadouts to one another. If you look at the heavies and assaults, for the most part, energy-heavy IS mechs have kind of fallen completely off the radar. But on the clan side, you have many other options, and this is often because when it comes to like a Hellbringer or a Mad Cat Mark II or the Marauder Mark II, they simply become better options in the grand scheme of things compared to your Grasshoppers, your Stalkers, or your Black Knights. Despite the fact that they might have similar hardpoint locations, loadouts, or different kind of shapes. And I know that this is a very loaded question because things such as geometry, shape, and scale come into the equation. But the general notion is that when you're picking energy-centric mechs, clans often tend to be the much better option to go with. And it's almost a universal thing that we see no real equivalent on the IS side that kind of cracks that code. And when we have mechs on the IS side who are either focused on that through flavor quirks, lore reasons, or just restrictions on the hard points, we can't have it to be to where so many mechs on one side of the faction spectrum lag so far behind when it comes to the overall builds that you can effectively bring into a match compared to the clan side. And that's pretty much what drives a lot of this investigation into narrowing the gap between the clan and IS side. It's not so much that we don't necessarily agree with the performance on the clan laser side, so much that there is this gulf between what an energy boat on the Inner Sphere side can effectively bring to the match, and what can a clan version of the exact same loadout to bring to the match. And that's what we're ultimately trying to address.
So, like, based off of that, you're saying that lasers are the one thing sort of out of whack in between balance. You still feel pretty good about the like ballistics and the missiles. That's why the energy is being focused on. Is that basically?
Chris, are you saying LRMs are perfect? Is that what you're saying?
We can get to that. We can get to that later. But,
basically, I'd like to touch on this at a higher level, like a mile-high level approach, right? This goes back into just core design of what's going on with balance. And the reason why you don't balance upward all the time is that, one, you're decreasing time to kill. Now, some people are out there just more than happy. Is like, I want decreased time to kill. I want to be able to just pop off 2 rounds and there's a dead mech in front of me. Right, but that's not the intention of MechWarrior Online. It's never been the intention of MechWarrior Online to be that fast of a killer. Right, I've seen examples of some people sending out videos and all this other stuff to different links about how balancing upward works in other games, and those other games are not games where you're trying to plow through tons of armor, then tons of inner structure. Right, those are person-to-person matches where you're just like one-shotting, two-shotting, three-shotting times. Right. And that's with a human skin being basically your armor and a very high velocity projectile being shot into that skin. But another thing that touches on when you're coming to upward power creep like that is that you're going to start getting the assaults, for example, dishing out tons of damage, which they should rightly do. But MechWarrior Online has always been about making sure that lights and mediums have a role in the game. Now, they shouldn't be overpowered where, like, a light should stand face-to-face with an assault.
Oh, sorry. I just had to
But at the same time is that if you think about it, it's like, okay, let's balance everything upward. That means overall DPS across the board is just shot up through the roof. Well, our counter to that, to continue with our current time to kill or even trying to lengthen it, is to buff the living snot out of armor. Oh, that sounds great. Let's do that to light mediums. Light mediums all of a sudden have these quirks that give them like 800 hit points of leg armor. Like, I'm exaggerating here, but sure. Okay, now the lights and mediums can survive. Well, what happens in the situation when a light mech meets a light mech? Do you know how long that fight's going to take? Yeah, we want to increase time to kill, but we don't want to make it so you're standing there for 30 minutes fighting each other, trying to blow one leg off. That's where the whole thing about power creep breaks. Right, and that's what we're trying to avoid to have happen. I mean, the light mechs, medium mechs, with the little bit of buffs that they've been given to armor just at the core value, they're in a range where they're kind of performing okay, right? There could be some adjustments there, but for now, let's say they're okay, right? An upward trajectory of weapon balance would just kill that connection that's happening right now, right? And that's why we're pretty much saying it's like, no, we don't want to balance upward, right? In terms of meeting that high alpha laser vomit that's happening on clan side right now. We want to bring that clan side down back towards the inner sphere. We're not going for parity, but we just want to bring it back down towards the inner sphere. So we don't have this situation where all of a sudden we have massive amounts of armor and inner structure on lights and mediums, right?
Yeah, we have a very unique situation here, and I was just discussing this with some friends that I game with the other day. You know, when you're playing other games, whether you're like infantry shooting each other or tanks or ships or whatever, you know, you've got either character levels. A level 1 character usually can't do any damage to a level 30 character, or a tier 1 tank or ship can't do any damage to a tier 10 tank or ship. We have a unique situation where every vehicle is viable, and it's also different. It's different than other games as far as how the damage is addressed and so forth. And so I think it's, again, I want to point out for anybody listening to this right now, don't worry, I don't have anything to do with the balance decisions. I'm just I'm here to listen and discuss. However, it makes me respect everybody that's involved, whether they're balancing for a different game other than ours or our game. I think it's again, we have a very unique situation.
I was gonna say it's tough too, because you know, like every single day interacting with community members, all different skill levels, all different sort of ages, and you can ask players, the veteran players that have been playing for a while, and it doesn't matter if they're top or whatever, and you can get 2 different answers, 3, 4 different answers. Like just asking, I've been playing in having like I was talking to Rhythm on stream not too long ago, and Bearclaw and so forth. And one of the things is you had 2 different answers. I could ask, like, do you think, you know, like laser vomit is a little bit OP on the clan side? And I got 1 yes and no, not really. And so there, you know, that's sometimes the difficult thing too, is like the community can be dead set of like, hey, no, this isn't a problem. And then PGI is like, this is a problem. And the thing that I think is really good and is that communication. You guys posted, you're saying, hey, we don't like where things are going. You don't have to agree with that as a community member. You don't have to agree. Like, to be fair, you don't have to agree. But now you at least know where Paul and Chris stand. You know, like Targato and Kaniyashi and people that create content in the community that talk about this all the time, at least now you know. So I think from my point of view, when we talk about laser imbalance, I bring up the Hellbringer. 65 tonners. We were just talking about this yesterday. It's a simple little task. Is it the mech or is it the weapon systems and equipment? And when you look at the mech, what it's capable of doing compared to other 65 tonners. So compare the Hellbringer to the Eben. Which one's better? You're going to get a mixed view there, you know, but for the most part, I would say the Hellbringer usually ekes out, and why you see it so often. And there's a few reasons for that. But then what you do is, okay, let's go across the pond. What are the best 65 tonners for the IS side? And then once you eke that out, now cross and say which one. And you have a Hellbringer, the 65 ton, 0 quirks, by the way. Now, there is one setup you can take where someone drops the left torso on the Hellbringer, the prime, and takes the F. That gets like a 10% or 10 or 5% heat. But that is very rare. I don't think you see that very often. So that argument, someone did bring it up. But compare the Hellbringer and Eben's performance to the IS side, and you've got Roughnecks that are right up there. But also look that the Roughneck has 30 extra hit points, you know, to the CT and some ballistic quirks. And yet, right? Yet the Hellbringer has 0, and yet you're seeing that sort of performance. And that's sort of why I talk about, like, there is something going on with lasers. They're like DPS per ton. They're fantastic. We all know it. And ER, and it is a really tough, you know, call as far as like, okay, well, do you decrease the damage? Well, then no, I'm never going to use it again. Do you increase duration? No, well, it's too long. And I do feel like there just needs to be compromise. The community has to realize something does need to happen. And that's where I look at the PTSs and I see, you know, value in the PTSs, because we're trying multiple different ideas. and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Chris.
To speak on the Hellbringer and the Ebon Jag side, I think that Phil basically brings up a good point. But one thing from my perspective is also the types of loadouts that you can take on the mechs, and what loadouts are the ones that are the problem when it comes to the entire is it the mech or the loadout discussions. What I always tend to look at is what happens when you take alternative loadouts in those mechs. If you go with a ballistic or a missile Ebon Jaguar,
no one does that.
But the thing is that take a ballistic Hellbringer or Ebon Jaguar, a missile Hellbringer and Ebon Jaguar. Now those mechs that are typically overperforming against equivalents with their energy boats. When they take ballistic or missiles, how do they stack up now to the rest of the 65-tonner lineup? And if they are still skewing above average, then yes, maybe it's the mech. But if it really is just... If someone can basically go into the mech lab and come up with a completely different loadout that doesn't involve lasers and have that be effectively on par with various mechs on the IS side... But then once he takes energy weapons, and then it just starts. It skews. Once he takes energy weapons, it starts skewing way above what the average what it does. Those are the things that effectively make us target these things, because on the IS side, there's still things like Thunderbolts in the 65-ton range that could effectively be energy boats that. Unfortunately lag behind those mechs like the Ebon Jaguar and the Hellbringer, who do the exact same thing at the exact same tonnage ratio, but much more efficiently than things like Thunderbolts or Roughnecks can do.
No, and I agree. What used to be the go-to Hellbringer setup, dual UAC 5s and ER mediums, that used to be the go-to. Now we didn't have some of the IS mechs at the time, but now if you were to take UAC 5s and mediums in a Hellbringer, I mean, someone would be like, dude, what are you doing? But I do think if you were to compare them to the IS side, they would be pretty balanced and maybe even skewed more towards IS, because guess what? Some of those IS mechs have not only, 30 points extra in the CT, armor and structure, plus weapon quirks, but they're also there to counter what? Well, which is the 65 to 75 sustainable alphas that are going around there.
Paul, I think you had something you wanted to say about the armor quirks.
Yeah, well, that's what I just wanted to quickly interject on, was that with these changes and with the direction currently focusing on the clan side laser vomit situation, is that we do realize that there is this inconsistency on the inner sphere side if we start doing those changes to the clan. Those 30-point quirks you're talking about are going to have to go away, right? Whether they're zeroed out or whether they're just reduced, but they're going to have to get reduced substantially, right? When it comes to the inner, let's talk about percentages here. Let's pretend that we're just going to do a global 20% nerf to clan lasers, right? The inner sphere structure reduction would have to be probably around a 30% thing. Now, I'm just using ballpark numbers here, just for an example.
Hypothetical, people.
The reason why the inner sphere armor nerf would be higher is just because of the pure damage number change that's going to happen on the clan side, right? Even if we just look at like a duration change like we did with a PTS 1.1, that's requiring a lot more time on target, a lot more phase time, right? That trade-off is massive compared to like a 5-point reduction on inner sphere armor, right? That's just not a fair thing to do, right? It's not going to feel right either. So if we do these things, I just want people to be very, very aware. Is like, this is not just a one-sided thing that's going to happen. We're taking a look at all aspects of what's happening in this change of damage.
And just to kind of add on to that, it's not just about the weapon output and kind of the effectiveness between IS and clans, but also all of the other things that we try to keep an eye on when it comes to overall balance for the game itself, which includes things like 20-tonners versus 100-tonners, and those lighter mechs. Like, how do they match up now against the IS mechs that do have reduced, structure and armor quirks? Does that make it easier for things such as the Viper or a Huntsman to pretty much be able to engage those heavier targets, where before the armor quirks might be a bit detrimental to them engaging them?
Okay, so I've got a question for you guys. Let's talk about LRMs for a moment. I'm gonna say my part, and then I'd love to hear, Paul and Chris's response. LRMs, for the most part, at a certain, I would say, skill level, have never really been used, or haven't been used in a very long time, because direct fire is king. Now, we've recently had buffs. We first had a velocity increase of 10%. I want to say 2-3 months ago. I want to say that was somewhere around there, to LRMs. And then recently we've had buffs as well. Now, the community's reaction, of course, has been filled with memes and sometimes a little bit of anger and angst. And why would you do this? And this isn't what we asked for. And oh my gosh, look at now what solo players or people can do, and trolling. But I will say, even still at the higher play, I still think that they're not going to be taken and they're not going to be used. We have a weapon system, indirect fire, that got buffed. I do feel it's a little bit of out of whack because of it can snowball very quickly. And we've got ECM, NARC, TAG, and of course, organization can go a long way. That all being said, I feel like LRMs are just in a weird place, and is that something that's, one, are you aware? Two, what's being done by, and is there ever going to be any mechanics change? Obviously, it's been suggested out there. Hey, indirect fire is cool, but you can't buff it the way it is because it becomes OP at how it is. Have you guys considered direct fire as well, being able to toggle stuff like that? My spiel, Chris, Paul.
I don't know. People are upset about it.
No?
I'm kidding. I'm going to let Chris touch on this one.
Okay, so kind of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture kind of thing. One of the core things that we also balance against is choices within the mech lab, and kind of the entire weapon roster in of itself. We don't want there to be dead weight in the mech lab. We don't want it to be where someone can come across a weapon that they might feel like they want to use it, and it's just utterly useless in game. And the thing that kind of started this entire process with LRMs really started with the way that at least myself was viewing kind of what the community was doing to people in queue when they were trying to take LRMs. As MechWarrior Online, because of the mech lab, is all about personal customization of the mechs that you have and taking into the matches to try to win an engagement. And what we were finding is that there was a lot of hostility towards those people who would take LRMs into matches. Sometimes very nasty hostility towards teammates that were basically trying to play the mechs that they wanted to play. And for the most part, 2 months ago, before the velocity buff, LRMs, not just at high levels, but at most levels, were a subpar weapon system. And as we basically said, we want to have the least amount of dead weight in the mech lab as possible. And especially when it came to the weapon systems, especially one with as unique of a mechanic as the LRMs, we don't want them to effectively just drag someone's build down. So we did set about improving it because we don't want a situation where that many weapon systems are just wasting space in the overall weapons roster. The velocity increases came when they came. They were pretty much hailed as much needed for the weapon systems, and even with the velocities increases at max range, it still takes about I would say 6 or 7 seconds for a volley to get all the way over to someone. And so even with the heat buffs, even with the velocity buffs, what we're still finding, and Phil, Darren, you can definitely chime in on this if I'm off base here, but in standard play, and against skilled opponents, the LRM is still a very subpar system. If you're prepared for it, if you recognize that it could be a potential threat on the battlefield, you can pretty much still play around it. But it is better than what it was prior, which was basically just wasting space in the overall weapons roster. We're not going to be in a position where we want to reduce the weapon back into obscurity to where people just don't take it anymore. But some of the things revolved around LRMs, such as the ease of use and kind of the force multipliers that are involved with it, are things that, through improving the baseline weapon, have kind of come under the microscope as things that now need to be looked at. Because what we're ending up seeing is that the baseline LRM system is still a very ineffective weapon system, but when you combine it with Artemis, when you combine it with Tag, when you combine it with Narc, when you combine it with the teamwork and coordination, it becomes effectively what you said, Phil, kind of a snowball weapon that becomes almost overwhelming at times. So ultimately, we don't want LRMs to become deadweight in the roster again, but we do recognize that the current state, there are a lot of things that kind of compound on them to be a bit of a nuisance in the current game. So coming August patch, we're going to be hitting the ease of use for the weapon, as well as a number of the force multipliers that compound on the baseline attributes for the weapon. So what this means is the biggest change is going to be pretty much a tightening of the lock-on mechanics itself. The actual kind of leeway before your weapon lock will start is going to be shrinking pretty substantially. I think it's going to be about 50% less surface area than it is currently. I'll have a graphic about it in the patch notes. Then after that, we're going to be hitting the Artemis system, specifically how it affects lock-on times and the tracking of the missiles itself. So there's a little bit more difficulty in trying to get those locks indirectly. When you're having Artemis, it doesn't provide the bonus anymore, and the tracking will pretty much not be what it is currently. From there, we're going to also hit the Narc launcher. So many of the videos that Paul was kind of alluding to that got forwarded to both of us were very much CW related, or the faction play related. This is where we found a little bit of an issue with the way that the current Narc launcher works, very specifically kind of the rate at which it can acquire targets. So we're actually going to be doubling the cooldown on Narc to kind of reduce those situations where a single Narc launcher can effectively tag half the team in less than 30 seconds. And from there, we're also going to be giving a boost to ECM range to pretty much give a little bit more counterplay and to make ECM a bit more of a team support weapon than instead of a kind of personal cloaking device.
Okay,
No.
so from my perspective, because I'm a average, maybe a little bit above average player, LRMs are never really an issue for me. I've been playing long enough to where I know how to counter, whether it be cover, teammate, a hill, building, whatever, or running ECM. I see the less skilled players, the more skilled players. I see their issues with LRMs, but I feel, for me, at my skill level, it's very situational. Yes, 1 out of 20 matches, I'll be killed by LRM rain or something. Maybe not even that. Maybe 1 out of 30, maybe 1 out of 40. I feel it's very situational where you come up against those, you're basically discussing, or in my opinion, it's a little bit of a lightning in a bottle where the other team has Narc and all these things, and 5 people have LRMs, and you get, whatever map that's terrible for LRMs. That just doesn't happen very often. I think that's very situational, and I feel people use that a little bit as a red herring. It's like, oh, look, I just had this match. Everybody on the other team had Narc and LRMs. Well, that was probably organized, and yeah, bad luck for you. But for me, on the most part, I don't have an issue with LRMs. I kind of also feel that LRMs it's our indirect weapon. Other games, people hate artillery for tanks, and they hate carriers for ships. And that will never change. It will never, ever change. I think there's people that just don't like indirect fire. They think it's unfair, it's cheating, it's whatever. It's not their play style. And so there's a lot of, I think, built up hate. I don't necessarily share that opinion. And all these balance changes you're talking about, I don't care one way or the other. If all of a sudden I go out and I'm getting killed by LRMs all the time, then I'm going to start caring about it a little bit more. I understand the people with more skill or less skill, these balances may affect and might be a good thing, and that's awesome. But it's just never been a big deal for me, my personal perspective.
And I think that comes down to that's fine, but there are things that players can do if they're running into it, which is one, find out what situation are you running solo or are you running group, and what situations are happening. So for instance, something that's sort of crept back into some of my builds, but it's on skill tree, is radar deprivation. Some of you guys weren't around when that was a module, and it was literally the go-to module. Like you didn't not take it, and it was instantaneously lose locks. Majority of the time, you can duck behind cover or duck behind a friendly. They lose a lock and they have to reacquire a lock and fly. Those are the type of things. Obviously AMS, obviously ECM. I think though the issue currently is that you have a weapon system that in an indirect form can be highly abused by a skilled player, but also by just regular Joe Schmoes that with a little bit of coordination, and it doesn't take a whole lot too. And I think that's how many supernovas do you see just sort of sitting back there now, just romp, 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 and that's where, again, I have to sort of ask, have you guys considered making, because you can't buff LRMs even more where they're at, right? Like I feel like that's where we're at, that where it's that tipping
You're saying
point.
You shouldn't.
You
right?
shouldn't.
Yeah.
Well,
I could.
You can.
Believe me, Paul can do whatever the hell.
But the problem is we don't have an alternate. And that's where I feel like the direct fire option, or you just leave LRMs where they're at. You do what you do as far as the changes, but I still feel like LRMs can be used in a direct fire manner. But I will say this, even if you had a direct fire toggle, if you will, I still see it being a hard pressed weapon to be effective as far as even at the higher skill level, because I still think direct fire, but I feel like they could be used a lot like how ATMs are being used. And that's why even decent players like ATMs and ATMs can be used, because they're the sort of reverse. You want to be closer to your targets, and if you're using ATMs and you can be right behind your friendlies, helping throw 3 damage per missile out, that's awesome. But I just feel like if have you guys considered doing a direct? Is that something that would be a possibility? Because I know it's asked about quite a bit.
Well, just kind of to rewind a bit, because I have to cover both Darren and what you've covered. But like we said, we've heard the criticisms from the community, and we also know that one of our general goals is to widen the viability of the overall weapon roster, and that includes LRMs. Like, we do want LRMs to ultimately have a place to where they're not effectively the cancer weapon or the weapon that you're going to ridicule your teammates for bringing into a match. We do want LRMs to be effective when utilized effectively, but with that said, we're always open to hearing about the current ease of use for the weapon, and we are going to be hitting the ease of use with this coming patch. We're aggressively going after a lot of those force multipliers, and that's going to probably be it for August, but we're still going to be open to hearing feedback as well as targeting improvements, provided that those improvements aren't there to effectively just remove one weapon from the overall roster.
All right, so I feel definitely like LRMs is one of those topics, and there's others, that is divisive in our community, right? We were talking about that earlier. I love our community, full of passion, but a lot of, like you were saying, Phil, a lot of differing opinions.
And you mentioned Artie, and I do think you're 100% right. Like, LRMs could be in a good spot, and someone's like, I fucking hate them, just useless.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that shows that our community is fractured, but whole. Sorry, I had to. But
well, one thing I'd like to just poke in on is
go, Paul.
I will state this is that we will never get LRMs to a point where everything's covered across every level
and everybody's
gameplay.
happy.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, never.
Right. LRMs are an area of denial service, which is utilized by not just lower tier, but mid tier. And sometimes the high tiers will try to use it. Right. But at the same time, it's not meant to be a direct fire. Well, not direct fire in terms of how you target. I'm just talking about you point at something and you fire LRMs at it. Right. It's a trajectory-based missile system, and that's the way it's currently playing out. Now, I'm not saying we need to buff it anymore or we need to nerf it or what either direction. I'm just saying is that it's never going to be a weapon system where everybody's just like, yeah, this is perfect. Let's go. Right.
Yeah. And again, I think, again, from a person who's been playing for 6-7 years, average, a little above average, maybe, it's just not a big deal. And I feel like a lot of times the arguments are based on very specific situational.
Well, one thing I haven't seen is even at the higher level, I haven't actually seen of any groups, because I've talked to a few. I haven't seen any Team X, Team B go to private matches and say, X map, we're going to design around LRMs, or at least have, a few on. Can you counter? And no, LRMs are still OP at the high, like I haven't seen that happen. What I have seen is, hey, skilled players are forming a group, and it doesn't even have to be a big one, and they're just raffle stomping the shit out of people on group queue. Now, that being said, same group of players could be in direct fire mechs and do it as well.
And do the exact same thing.
But I guess what their argument is, and I think it's valid, is the ease of use, though. The ease of use from a player taking those LRMs and how easy it was to narc or tag and just rain hell, and the enemy team couldn't really do anything. And I think that's the valid criticism, and so the changes what you're talking about, Chris, I think will work. Have you guys what about line of sight? Are you guys happy with the indirect fire nature? Is that you guys are good to go on that?
Well, like I've said before on multiple tuning balance change stuff, is that we're always investigating and we're always tuning. So yes, we'll be keeping an eye on it, but I can't promise any sort of new systems coming online, right? It's not off the table. I just can't say, yes, we're heading that direction.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right, Chris, is there anything else, or Paul, in regards to balance? Before we kind of restate the results of 1.0 and 1.2, 1.1, and what's coming up, is there anything else about balance that you'd like to touch on?
Well, I just want to touch on the scope of balance, right? It's not just about changing numbers in an XML statement. It's not about looking around and just watching people play, observing what's going on the battlefield. There's so much more in play. One of the contention points I still hear about is something like the engine desync, right? And I'm going to go out so far as to say as that engine desync did what we wanted to do. Did it have any sort of negative impact? Yes, it actually did, and we're very well aware of it. This is something that I've been talking with Chris for quite a while, but it's always been on the horizon. Sure, now's the time we can pull up closer into our direct path of balance changes, right? One thing I've always been concerned about is the impact of the engine desync on the heavies and assaults. Now, I'm not saying that they should be rebuffed back up to the level pre-engine desync. There's no way in hell that's going to happen because, like I said, the engine desync did the majority of what we wanted it to do. But there is, on a case-by-case basis at a chassis level, right, where we can start giving some agility back to the heavies and assaults. Now, Chris's primary target, when I first mentioned this, he says exactly the Atlas, right? And the Atlas took a pretty big hit when it came to agility. So yeah, let's give him back some, right? I've never wanted a state where an assault mech just cannot bring their weapon systems to bear on a light mech running around, right? I'm not saying you should be able to track them and get a full laser burn on them, right? But at the same time, you should be able to swing your mech around quick enough to try to at least get a shot off on them, right? And in some cases, that's just not happening right now. So that's one direction we need to look at. The other thing is that, for example, this whole discussion about the laser duration, the damage levels, all this kind of stuff, how we're going to address all that. Well, all of this is fine and dandy, but when you're addressing a weapon system, right, you're doing a global wide faction based change, right? If something like the duration change, which I do believe like is a good direction to head, but we just got to make sure we don't overdo those numbers. But we got to look into things like, well, how is this affecting the lights and mediums in the mech bay, right? Well, let's take a look at it. Well, some of these lights, they can only bring a very few number of energy weapons, right? And they're obviously tonnage restricted. So what can we do to help them? And that's when we can start bringing in back what the quirk system was actually meant for, was a flavor-based scenario where if you have a mech that can only carry 2 medium lasers, well, that laser duration nerf hit this guy pretty hard. Well, let's give him a quirk that gets rid of that nerf, or it might not get rid of it, but it'll affect that nerf. It'll let him run more heat efficient, right? Maybe the damage is higher. Who knows, right? But we'll counter the negative impact based on tonnage, right? In terms of lights and mediums, rather than just saying, you know what, you just got to deal with it, right? So it's just, we have a multifaceted, I don't know, it's not a Rubik's Cube, it's more like a Rubik's tetrahedron or whatever, right? And we have to make sure that we're looking at all angles, and I just want to make sure that everybody out there knows that we are looking at those angles.
The Rubik's, what did you call it? Tetrahedron?
Sure.
The less popular
I don't even know
in the 80s.
I don't even know if that's a proper shape. But
What is that? What are you old people talking about?
Who
I
knows?
don't even know.
So, Chris, what about you? Follow up any other balance
Well,
points you want to make?
just to touch on what Paul said about the engine desync and it basically doing what we designed it to do. Engine desync was never meant to basically replicate what the full mastery skills did before. The engine desync was primarily there to basically get you those base agility, and then the skill tree was there to replicate the mastery system from before. So when we basically tuned the initial engine desync, we were going more for those baseline values because we were counting on people to reinvest in mobility through the skill tree. So in things like the Atlas, like Paul said, in actuality, the engine desync actually gives it more base agility than what it had prior to the introduction of the engine desync in the skill tree. But what we're finding is that people are just not investing in the skill tree to reinvest in those mobility attributes to get it back. So we are going to be looking at kind of giving the heavies and assaults a second look for some of them to pretty much bring up their natural stats and hopefully make the skill tree a bit more appealing on the mobility front to get you even greater mobility than what you had prior to it. But I think that when it comes to the overall discussion, that we just have to kind of remind people that engine desync was more about getting those baseline attributes prior to the old mastery system. So under the old system, it would be effectively the mech you would get with 0 experience and no skill unlocks. Whereas now you get the baseline values, and now it's boosted through the skill tree to either get those old values through, I think, about 20 points worth of investment in the skill tree, or go even further from that through more investment in other parts of the mobility tree.
And I think what's tough with that, though, is from a player standpoint, they're going to invest in firepower, they're going to invest in protection, and what you're saying is, you know, obviously the mobility tree just has to be more enticing, but if they choose not to take the mobility, whereas before the mechs just had it, that's where I feel like a lot of the players just sort of like, you know, like, and of course I'll quote someone, my spirit bearer just don't feel the same, you know.
Well, here's the thing: is like I said, we're not going to take it back to like pre-engine desync, but at the same time, it's like, yes, okay, we're going to give you the agility that you kind of had, right? And because you're getting this baseline buff to your agility, the investment into the skill tree is just that plus beyond, right? So it's not just saying, okay, you probably want to spend some points in the mobility tree just because it's there. No, we're saying, like, now that we have an increased agility baseline, right? That buff that you're buying into with a skill tree is even more valuable to you.
And of course, that's good. I just feel like again that's just sort of emphasizes sort of how like we as players, we look at the skill tree and what's important to us. And if I'm getting a little bit more base agility, then well, maybe my mech feels better. Yeah, now I don't need to invest. And that's the min max player is, oh, okay, I got a little bit more.
Exactly. But the thing is,
I'm not going to even dump it into the skill tree anymore.
Yep, that's exactly the reasoning behind it too, right? It becomes a decision point that you're going to make, right? Do you want to make your assault? Do you want to make your assault like crazy agile? Then invest in the skill tree. If not, and you're happy with it where they currently are with this new buff, right? Hey, just leave it at that.
And that's where I feel like quirks, or in the case of mobility, I know it's just baseline stats. You can go on a you can do per chassis per variant if you really want to improve. Because again, if you buff, let's just say the Kodiak 3's agility back to where it was baseline, no one's going to take the mobility. They're just going to be like, oh, hey, my toy's back. Let me take firepower and protection. Whereas you could buff some of those other Kodiaks in the baseline and bring them up, and it's not like they'll be abused. Sorry, KDK3 players. There's always going to be stuff that and again, someone could suggest something and it sounds good, but then it'll have reverse effects and
what is it I always say, Phil?
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, and look, there's a lot of brilliant people in this community. Absolutely. Terragato and there's a whole bunch of them out there.
Let's be honest.
Yes.
Like Chris and I saw Terragato's video on his discussion points, right? And it is the resource that we pulled from to do the decision to make the duration changes rather than just damage or heat or anything else like this, right? So let's give props where props are due.
Yeah, and that's great. And that's the thing me and Chris talk about, is we'll see ideas, we test them. But even with the test, yes, it may not be exact numbers, and I think there has to be compromise, is that there's a reverse effect that we saw. Yes, it was a community idea. Yes, there is a validity in testing it. We tested it. What is the reverse effect? Well, your mech actually runs more sustainable. And to be fair, that's okay.
Well, can I interject here, Phil?
Yes.
Another thing, as we said earlier in the podcast, the testing values are always at the extreme end of what we want to test, because we're mostly trying to look at what this direction does for us and where the breakpoints are. So I know that there's a lot of strong feelings towards the actual values that we put up for testing, but just keep in mind that what we put up on PTS is not meant for final release. It's meant for internal testing and to getting those data points when we basically push along this route, and to monitor both what the player reaction is as far as what they do and what they make adjustments to in their builds when they bring it into the PTS, but also where those breakpoints are and what are our absolute limits for how far we can push those before we start running into issues.
When it comes to things like the numbers on PTS, like Chris is saying, is that they are set high, right? Just so we can see the overall effect. And then we start playing with the numbers between PTS 1 and 1.1. Now, the numbers changes between the two were very minimal. Like the number of actual edits to the XML files were very minimal, right? That's because we saw what came out of 1.0. We wanted to see what would come with the changes suggested, plus the stuff we wanted to take a look at. That's what the delta was between those two, and we got a new set of numbers. And like I said in my post, is like they're not meeting our criteria. They're in the right direction, but they're just not there yet, right? So we're not going to use those numbers. Another thing is that we're looking at these kind of changes that will make a minor impact on this overall laser and alpha problem that we have. One of the things is that we've always been talking about this 94 point alpha, right? I mean, we're not looking to take that 94 alpha and making it 60, right? What we're trying to do is just shave anything we can off of it. If the numbers we change using duration, a little bit of damage reduction, take 4 points of damage off that and make it 90, hey, at least that's in the right direction, right? Is it as far as we want it to go? Not really. But at the same time, it's like that would be the extreme that our current direction is going. If we go any further, it's going to start really negatively impacting gameplay. Well, guess what? We're just going to deal with that 4-point reduction. Then we'll look for other areas to help us to get rid of some more of the overall damage.
It's like whittling a piece of wood just a little bit at a time to achieve that. What I feel is like we're never going to achieve perfection, right? Because it's a living, breathing entity. Do we want to discuss where we're going next? We've had PTS 1.0 and 1.1. Are we going to have a 1.2, a 2.0, something like that?
Well, one of the other things that has been brought up, suggested, and it's something we looked into before, but at the same time, it's like, let's take a look at it again. Let's just try it out, right? And that's the heat cap and faster dissipation. And Chris
cool
has...
shots?
Yeah, cool shots. They're going to cost 8 times as much.
Damn it. Sorry, guys.
Well, speaking of cool shots, that is one thing that we're also going to be potentially looking at changing in the August patch as well. Again, this kind of gets back to something that I hear about quite a bit is just the overall skill points in for the power out that you get through the skill tree and just the native power of cool shots themselves. And what we're ultimately targeting this incoming patch is the effectiveness of cool shots for energy weapon builds as opposed to ballistic and missile builds. So we are going to be expecting some cool shot changes, not to the actual amount that they dissipate, but we're going to be stretching that 14 points of base heat that you get from them across a 3-second duration rather than a single second duration coming in the next patch.
So instead of it just dumping heat, it'll dump heat over 3 seconds.
Yeah, it'll still dissipate the same 14 heat that it does right now, but it's going to take just a little bit more foresight to use it and not just burn it right before you use your weapons.
So
what do you guys think, Phil? What do you think the result of that will be? How will that play out?
Well, I mean, the big thing is how you use it. Is if you're pressing, again, Hellbringer, whatever you're running hot with, and you go to alpha and you're hitting your limit anyways, just be able to hit it again, and literally you're able to alpha one more time, if not 2. So it's like it's a free potentially 60-70 damage boom right there. Yeah. So that's good. I do want to ask, have we ever considered removing them?
Above my head. That would be a Paul question.
Yes, at least now it costs skill points, whereas before it was just a module slot and so forth. And not all mechs had them, and that was also another thing. But I feel like since their introduction, it's not like they have a drawback. And again, it's not like you use a cool shot and then you have, your dissipation rate sucks afterwards. It's not like MechWarrior 4 where you had a cool shot bar and that's all you had or whatever. I just feel like since their introduction, it just leads to imbalances when it comes to heat. Have we thought about just removing cool shots?
Well, Chris mentioned that he said this discussion was above his head, and I'm going to say that it's actually above mine too. Right?
What?
Cool shots were always a hot debatable topic here internally, right? I don't know. It's something that we could bring up again, right? But right now, addressing just currently what's in game is what's priority for us right now.
Yeah, and just to also reiterate, I know I've said this on your stream a few times, Phil, but although I can't remove cool shots from the game, I can definitely take steps to better balance it against the other options that are around the game. So we're not opposed to necessarily changing the way that they currently work, but we do have to factor in their inclusion into the game as it is, because as Paul said, it's above our heads that this is an item that does exist in the game and does have to have a purpose within the game, but I can definitely take steps to balance the actual use of it within the game.
So that will obviously be a potential discussion topic that we bring up with Russ when we have him on a future podcast, which we've been chatting with him. He wants to do one. He's had a busy summer. So I think we can expect to have him on soon. But I would like to wrap this one up. So to you again, Chris or Paul, PTS 2.0, do we want to give any indication of when this might be happening, or do we want to leave it open?
Well, personally, I just want to make sure it gets out there fairly quickly, right? Don't want to spend too much time spinning wheels here.
Sure.
Like, I just want the community to understand is that we are not just sitting here like, oh, okay, let's take our time, analyze the metrics, let's drag this out. No, right? We're trying to come up with something that's comprehensive, allows us to make the changes that we want in the game, that some of the changes that you want in the game. And to be able to do that in a somewhat timely manner. But the thing is, when I say somewhat timely manner, is that we are working full bore here on all aspects of not just MWO, but we have MechWarrior 5 going, right?
MechCon.
And yeah, there's a lot of stuff on
How's
the go
that
here.
Super Pod coming along?
We just got a final quote on price, and yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's awesome. And it's all good stuff. It just
It's going to be very cool.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So 2.0 coming up. Again, I want to reiterate, we spoke on this at the beginning, player feedback on this, because we're wanting this to be a discussion and get the feedback. The place for everybody to go and take part in this discussion of balance is the MWO forums, correct, Paul?
Yes, and let me just clarify this.
Mm-hmm.
Russ likes to talk on Twitter, right? I don't.
Yep.
Russ points all of your Twitters at me. Right? If you want concentrated, focused feedback on balance, and you want to be talking with Chris and I directly, right? Get it in that forum thread. Reddit is not the place for it. Twitter is not the place for it, especially with Twitter's character limit, which is just so anti-discussion. It's not funny.
Threads, Paul, threads. Right.
But at the same time, it's like, let's get it into the forums, right?
Yep.
Like, I see this numerous times. Every time I say this, is like, get it in the forums. Oh, it's just the brown sea.
Mm-hmm.
No.
They're
right?
not going to read it.
We're going to be taking care of it, right?
Yep.
I mean, if you're going to go in there and just post like some sort of madman, yeah, you're probably going to get moderated and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But come in there with your opinions, stated in a productive manner, right? It's going to get heard, it's going to get analyzed, and we're going to come back and say, yeah, or no, right? I can't say, sorry, don't let me sit there promising you that every single post
everyone's going to get a response.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the key points are going to be addressed, right? Things that come up and make us just go, can we go that direction? Or, you know what, that's completely off the table. We just can't do that, right? We'll let you know.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point to make. Is that number one, Reddit, podcasts, Twitter, tweets, whatever, great way to discuss things. But if you're wanting to take part in this discussion directly with Chris and Paul on balance, on PTS, then go to the MWO forums and post, in a mature, civil way. And I guarantee you they're going to read it. I already know. I see them reading this stuff every single day. Yes, Chris?
I was just going to say, as I've kind of said a few times on my own Twitter, there are multiple stakeholders in all of these changes. And just tweeting to either myself or Russ on our personal Twitters is the worst way to get in front of all the people who have eyes on these discussion points. So by all means, the best place to go is still going to be the forums and not Reddit or Twitter, because it is the easiest guarantee that it gets in front of all of the people who are behind the scenes looking at these things and making these decisions.
And if you post it on my Twitter, it's going to get read about once every 2 weeks.
There you go. All the reasons to point you directly to MWOmercs.com. Go to the forums, check it out. And I want to thank you, Phil and I both want to thank you, Chris and Paul, for being here, having this discussion on balance and PTS. More PTS coming soon, folks, so let's keep our eyes out for that. Take part in the discussion. And then, Paul, we're going to have another one of these for faction warfare coming up soon, right? Maybe a week, two, somewhere. It's going to be rather quick, so I won't go out as far as 2 weeks.
It's going to be this month.
Well, for sure, this month.
It's going to be before we hit...
before patch day, yeah?
The 15 number on the calendar?
Okay, the 15 number. That would be halfway through the month. So...
Yes.
And I think it'll be before patch day. So, guys, we will have an upcoming podcast regarding faction warfare, and then hopefully something soon with Russ as well, and maybe Matt. We'll talk about MechCon. We'll talk about MechWarrior 5. Everything else that Chris and Paul don't want to talk about, we'll bring up there.
Or can't.
So, or can't. Any last words?
Well, there's that one thing that we're talking about. Oh wait, this isn't the Master Challenge.
No.
It can't end like that in everything that we do, Paul. No, it's been great talking to you guys.
Yes.
And we will be doing this more often. This is part of the discussion. And this is just an instigator. Now you guys, the discussion happens with you guys in the forums. Head on over there, mwomerks.com right now. See you on the forums. Paul, Chris, thank you. And everybody.
Thank you for doing this.
Yeah,
Have a great
let's
night.
say have
Thanks,
a
guys.
good weekend. Mama Bear, it's a pleasure seeing that bearded, beautiful face. Just saying.
Good to see you too.
And I'd like to say again, thank you to all of you guys tuning in. Thank you for being a part of this discussion. And of course, head over to the forums. We will read or watch if maybe you make a video. I'm sure we'll get all the data points from you guys as well. But just want to say thank you again for coming out here and listening to the podcast. We do have more to come. This has been your local No Guts, No Galaxy MechWarrior podcast. Signing off for tonight. This is Phil.
And this is Darren.
Until next time, Mech Warriors.
It'd be best if you avoid me, but I know you probably can't. You sense something is wrong with me. You can feel it on my skin, but there is more within. Maybe I can be closer now, but I don't know how. Please help me remove my metal skin, my metal skin, my metal skin, and the wires within. You probably thought it was normal, just a little off. The truth is, at one time I was, but now I'm a robot. Forever.